Good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's good to see you. I'm Janet Vogel. I'm the director of the library, and I want to welcome everybody here to the room for our Friends of the Library Fall 2023 program. And I would like to point out a big thank you to the Friends of the Library members who are here, because this room looks the way that it does thanks to the Friends of the Library. So they supplied the funds to support the lighting and the paint in this room. And then we received an ARPA grant to upgrade the projector in the back. We are also very grateful for. And I'll just point out briefly, so we are also broadcasting on Zoom. And so that's one reason why we use the microphone here. So when we get to the end during the Q&A section, Ella will be my legs and will, for those on Zoom, I'm going to cast this thing. But Ella will be my legs, and we'll go around and hold the microphone for you all so you can be heard on Zoom. And then I'll moderate the Zoom as well. So for those of you on Zoom, you'll be able to have your questions answered as well. So now that we've taken care of one more housekeeping detail. So we do have snacks and coffee and tea back there. Please feel free to enjoy. And then Tom has graciously agreed to give away some copies of his book. So make sure that you fill out the little entry slip at the back by the sink. I tried to put it near the food. And we'll do the drawing at the end of the night. So please do fill that out so you can win a copy of his book. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Ella Kirk, who's the president of the Friends of the Library, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thanks, Ella. It's something with bent, and so we covered it with a little carpet square.
So I just use this. When you look at Zoom, I just okay, good. Thanks a lot for coming tonight. It's a wonderful program I think that we've got planned. And it's my honor to welcome Thomas Bacher here. He did graduate from Hiram, you probably know that, in 1978. I gotta put my glasses on here, so I can read. And he had a double major in philosophy and German. He also holds an MBA from Purdue University. And among his many professional accomplishments, Bacher was the director of the Purdue University Press and the Akron University Press, the vice president of marketing and sales for M.E. Sharp Incorporated. He was also director of systems and operations for the Greenwood Publishing Group, and the marketing systems manager and journal production manager for Cambridge University Press. Very interesting. So Tom is also the editor of Under the Rust Belt, Revealing Innovation in Northeast Ohio, which is on the Hiram Authors web display downstairs on the first floor as you come in. And he also edited another book of interest to Northeast Ohio audience. And this is called Zips on the Pitch, a history of soccer at the University of Akron. So of course, Tom's most recent book, The Essential Liberal Arts, which is going to talk about tonight, focuses on historical sketches of Hiram College, and it's the reason why we're all here tonight. So we look forward to hearing him share stories and anecdotes about the history of Hiram College. And thank you, Thomas, for being here tonight and speaking with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I don't think I need that. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Before I begin, I thought I'd let something else do the talking for me. I hope.
Footsteps are rapid, silent, leisurely. Footsteps layer the fresh snow. Footsteps disappear in the rain. Footsteps go places. Footsteps come back home. Footsteps connect the past to the present. My name is William Holt. When I was younger, I walked from Massachusetts to a rich town of Ohio. That was a mighty long walk. Began working as a stone mason. I was well known for the people, bridges.
We're gonna restart the PowerPoint. It's having a problem. I was making sure the sound was good on the webinar, so that's why I was. I might need to put us on the wired internet connection.
So I can tell you some things in the interim. So exploring the past for me revolves around images or photographs or the written word. All of them capture a moment in time and space, not to be too Einsteinian about it. Historians contend that if you don't learn about the past, you're going to make the same mistakes in the present. There is some truth in that, I think. But Hiram graduate named Louis Mink posited that the narrative is in principle incapable of representing past events because all narratives by nature distort or misrepresent the events or actions they depict. In other words, I write history, or we write history, based on presuppositions and subconscious experiences. Or in other words, we write fiction. Our lens does not always bring clarity to events that have happened ages ago. Our human nature does, however, try to make sense of historical events, providing us comfort. And that ends the academic portion of the presentation. Hiram's history can be told in many, many ways. I'll tell you about some things in my way. This whole project started. We can rewatch the video and then I'll tell you about the project.
Footsteps are rapid, silent, leisurely. Footsteps layer the fresh snow. Footsteps disappear in the rain. Footsteps go places. Footsteps come back home. Footsteps connect the past to the present. My name is William Holt. When I was younger, I walked from Massachusetts to Richtown, Ohio. That was a mighty long. Began working as a stonemason. I was well. Whatever was needed for the Cleveland and Pittsburgh village. The board of the eclectic contracted me to build the edifice for the institute. They wanted me to construct a building that resembled the Farmington Academy in Farmington, Ohio. My crew of men worked over the spring, summer, and fall to complete the building. We labored daily from dawn to dusk. We quarried the rock for the foundation and laid the bricks on the outside. The building opened on November 27, 1850. 84 students showed up to begin their education. Several were from children of local families, including the Atlaws, Masons, Udalls, Haydens, and Rains. A handful came from out of state. Henry Dixon, who became a disciples preacher, came all the way from England. The Eclectic's main building stood until 1969. The foundation we put up stood the test of time.
As I said, the journeys can start anywhere. One of the journeys I took was finding this particular photo. It was nicely done. There's a year on it, 1898. The names are there. The names are on the back too, of the students that are in this particular photograph. You can see that it's staged. I don't think they all looked that way when the photographer would take it. And in those days, it was a bit of a chore to take a photograph. The building in the background is Bowler Hall. And it was, I think, in the spring that this picture was taken. And so you can look at a picture like this, and you can learn a lot. And in the next few minutes, we will learn a lot about the people that are in this particular picture. And it presents sort of the history of the college in a very personal way. And it allows you, or allowed me, to go down many rabbit holes. And as I went down those rabbit holes, there were always other things that popped up, so you have to add things. And then you end up not remembering what you were starting to do in the first place. But this picture was in the archives, in the picture collection of the archives. This is two of the folks in the picture. They married afterwards. It's Edith Baumgardner and Faye H. Harvey. And Baumgardner was a school teacher prior to getting married. And Harvey's father owned a plow production company in Stowe, Ohio, and his plows were well known. So Harvey began to manage that company, and afterwards he became a bank manager in the area. This is Susie May Hall. She was a class of 1901. She married Mervyn L. Jenny, who was in the class of 1899. You'll notice a theme here about marriage in the next few slides too. Jenny was a minister, and he worked at several churches, including those in Sharon and Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and Mansfield, Ohio. This is Louise Lulu Dealing. She was an ex-student in 1901, An ex-student was someone that attended the college for more than just one term. They would have been designated as a student in the alumni guides of the time. So she went through several years at the college, and before finishing college, she married William B. Hubble, who was a student at the college too in 1896, and he became a doctor. Elizabeth Roberts was of the class of 1898. That means she graduated. She did then marry William Robert Davis, who was in the class of 1898. And Davis went on to get his DDS and become a dentist from the University of Michigan. And he also was the president of the American College of Dentists in 1936. And one final young lady at the time, Adrian Jones, who was an ex-student in 1901, married Clinton Mason Young, who also was in the class of 1898. Young received his mining engineering degree from Case and worked for the U.S. Bureau of Mines and was the head of Department of Mining and Metallurgy at the University of Kansas for 10 years. The interesting thing though, when you do these looks for people, and I have access to newspapers.com, which allows me to look at newspapers over hundreds of years. And also I have access to ancestry.com, because you have to do a lot of searching sometimes to find these people and what they did. In this particular case, when I was looking for Clinton Mason Young, I found out that he returned to Hiram in 1957, and he fulfilled his boyhood dream. As a child, he remembered eating crisp apples in the Hiram area, and they were freshly picked, obviously. So what did he do? He found a piece of land that was here in the town, and he grew 20 varieties of apples. And he called it a half-acre apple museum. Unfortunately, both Adrian and Clinton died in a car crash on October 14th, 1957. They are buried in the Fairview Cemetery. But what this shows in the late 1800s is that a number of women who came to the college because they didn't have a lot of options to find work other places, and not just because they didn't want to, but they got married. That was one of the options. I mean, people still get married at the colleges these days too, but they didn't have as many options as they do now to maybe go out into the workforce. And of course, there was no childcare during those years, unless you were very, very wealthy. So you had to make a choice. Am I going to be a homemaker? Am I going to find a job? And we'll see a few people in this particular photo that actually did find some other employment. And they really couldn't do both at the same time. The gentleman, on the other hand, in the picture had a few more options, obviously. This is Webb Chamberlain. He did marry Lucy Livy, who was from the class of 1903. And Chamberlain became a physician. Actually, his son did too, Webb Chamberlain Jr. And those are difficult things to do, because right before I came here, I had to re-look up Webb Chamberlain Sr. because I had information about Webb Chamberlain Jr., and they both happened to be physicians. But I found Webb Chamberlain Sr., and he was on the Hiram Board of Trustees also in the early 1940s. The other thing that you should know is, if you want to be remembered from an archival point of view, you should have a very unique name. If you have Jones and Smith or something like that, it makes it much harder to dig deeper and find sort of things about you. You can find them, but it takes a long, long time to do so. In the ancestry.com, maybe some of you use that. there's a lot of information that you can find from censuses and other places, and you have to sort of piece things together in order to get a full story of what went on. Howard Spencer Woodward was from the class of 1902, rather dapper-looking gentleman. He was good at presenting. He won the state intercollegiate oratorical contest while at Hiram. He won it, I think, in Akron. It was held that year. And there was a large story about it in the Akron Beacon Journal, where all the students of Hiram went there, or most of the students. They actually had a urban car that took them there. And they had a very large celebration when he won. Oratory, as if you noticed, was in that period of time from the 1880s probably into the early 1920s, was basically as well attended at the college as sports were. There was a very large, and that shouldn't be a surprise, because a lot of the early graduates of Hiram College went on to become ministers. So they had to be very good at the pulpit. And so there was a very good oratory department. He used that, and he went on to become a professor of speech at Western Reserve University from 1909 to 1942. George Forbes, not the George Forbes people might know, but George N. Forbes, was an ex-student, and he became a dairy farmer in Bedford, Ohio. The Claude Randolph Koch, he was an ex-student in 1905. He was difficult to find information about. Some people are easier, some people are harder. You're going through searches of newspapers, I couldn't find much about him. Sometimes there's misspellings that happens in newspapers too, that lead one to rethink what goes on. But I couldn't really, I found his middle name, which helped, Randolph. And all I could find out was that he worked in Cleveland after he left Hiram College. Louis Daniel Gould was an ex-student in 1903. He was the brother of Annie Gould, you'll see in a moment. And their father was a disciples preacher, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone here in the room either, because Hiram was a disciples institute founded by the disciples. So there were a lot of disciples preachers. In fact, there were a lot of disciples missionaries too, up until the 1920s at the college. And there was when we talk about being independent women, one of the things that independent women could do was become missionaries. And they could go overseas. Some of them were married, some weren't. And they worked usually in India and China and Japan in the early part of, or the late part of the 1800s, the early part of the 1900s. Gould's father owned a large farm in Bedford, Ohio, but his father was the son of Mr. Gould, who was a founder of Bedford, Ohio. So they had a bit of money. He worked in Cleveland for a while, but not very long. And he then moved to Pasadena, California. And I think he retired there at an early age. Two of the more independent women of that picture were Annie Gould, and she was from the class of 1898. She had, in the yearbooks, you could put down a sentence or two to describe yourself or describe something that interested you. In the spider webs, the yearbooks of Hiram College. And she wrote next to her name, "Do you not know that I am a woman? When I think I must speak. She went on to be a professor of history at the college at Hiram from 1907 to 1921. She was the first lady principal of the college from 1907 to 1911. And she was the first dean of women at the college from 1911 to 1921. She never married. And there's probably many reasons, but one is she could do what she wanted to do without having to worry about that. I don't think she could have done that in that day and age without it. Another very independent woman was Bernice May Finney from the class of 1899. Another woman that didn't get married, and she was a teacher in Cleveland for over 33 years. And she was the assistant principal at Lincoln High School, and she was the president of the Hiram College Club of Cleveland. So this one small photo had all this information in it. And it also looks at, if you look at that time period, which was 1898, you can find out some information about how students thought of themselves, what they could do in life. And if you look at the era in history of the United States, it was sort of, the Industrial Revolution. Women were starting to want to do more things in life than they could. Men always were able to do many of the things, as you see, they're doctors and lawyers that come from Hiram at the time. But it's in the dress, and you could go into all the details of the dress and how they look and how they interact with each other, which we don't have all that much time to do. But it's a fascinating, just look at one little tiny piece of what went on, one photo from the archives, and then a few or more than a few hours of work to go and find out about these people.
Dear, what can the matter be, dear? Dear, what can the matter be? Oh, dear, what can the matter be? Women are wanting to go. Oh, dear, what can the matter be, dear? Dear, what can the matter be? Oh, dear, what can the matter be? Women are wanting to go. Women have husbands, they are protected. Women have sons, by whom they're directed. Women have fathers, they're not neglected. Why are they wanting to vote? Women have homes, there they should labor. Women have children whom they should favor. Women have time to learn of each neighbor. Why are they wanting to vote? Oh, dear, what can the matter be, dear? Dear, what can the matter be? Oh, dear, what can the matter be? Women are wanting to vote. Women can dress, they love society. Women have cash with all its variety. Women can pray with sweetest piety. Why are they wanting to vote? Women are traveling about here and there. Women are working like men everywhere. Women are crowding, then claiming 'tis fair. So why are they wanting to vote? Oh, dear, what can the matter be, dear? Dear, what can the matter be? Oh, dear, what can the matter be? Women are wanting to vote. Women have reared all the sons of the brave. Women have shared in the burdens they gave. Women have labored this country to save, and that's why we're wanting to vote. Oh, dear, what can the matter be, dear? Dear, what can the matter be? Oh, dear, what can the matter be? Why should men
part of the reason that women were prominent at Hiram too, from the beginning, is because the institution was co-ed from the beginning. When Hiram was founded, obviously, we were sort of in the Wild West in Ohio. The state had just been founded in the early 1800s. And most of the people that came here, especially in the Western Reserve area here, were from Connecticut in the East, and they were given parcels of land as pay for fighting in the Revolutionary War. So they built towns around here, like Hudson, that looks very much like any East Coast town you might go to. But it was a willingness to sort of break the barrier and allow women to actually come and study here. The disciples, when they built the institute, because there are so many farmers around, because that was probably the primary means of what people did here, they wanted to educate their children, give them an institute that they could do that in. And that was one of the reasons why the institute was founded. What you can see here is another form of visual history. These are images that were done by Leroy Taskey. And he was a student at Hiram. And since it was kind of costly to do photographs for the Hiram spider webs, they had illustrations done. And so I got fascinated with some of the illustrations done and the illustrators. And these are sort of two that show how students felt about their faculty. And I don't think it's changed much, although in those days, I think the faculty had even more power than they do now. Students could get expelled rather easily if they did something that wasn't appropriate, although a lot of it didn't happen. But the students had their own sort of little vocabulary too that they used regarding sort of faculty and the school in general. One of, and these were in the spider webs too. One term they used was a call down. And you probably can understand what this is, but it was a gentle reprimand administered by any of those in authority to an erring student, supposedly to render the victim uncomfortable. They had a term we know today, exam, which was a superfluous process in which a student tells a few things he doesn't know and omits all he has ever learned. They flunk was to be suddenly rendered speechless upon having a question propounded by a professor. A lady principal, a being created for the purpose of keeping young ladies in constant terror. So those are the library, a resort for perchers. Now we need to know what perch is. The state of finding it difficult to go anywhere alone, or dating, which was what perching was. Perching was the term that was used in Hiram into the 1950s, or even into the early 1960s, because students, when the institute was first built, there was a white fence around it, and students would wander over to the fence and sit on the fence, and they would wait for a perch to show up. And that perch would sit on the fence too. And that's how the term got used as perching. The fence went away after several years, but the perching term stayed around. Stab, to attempt to impress a professor with the idea that you have spent about 2 hours on your lesson, when in reality you have spent about 2 minutes. To stab or not to stab, that is the question. So this is how students sort of viewed faculty, which hasn't changed much. The classes, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, but the juniors did the yearbook at the time. They were able to do that. And the classes were very much sort of in competition with each other during the 1800s, early 1900s. Among some of the traditions that we don't have anymore was something called a flag rush, where the sophomores would plant a pole in the middle of campus, they'd grease it up, and the idea was for the freshmen to try to overcome the sophomores, shimmy up the pole and plant their flag there. And the whole town came to watch. The whole town wasn't that big, but the whole town came to watch. A few people got injured, scuffed and bruised, but that was a yearly tradition. And it was said that it built character. I guess it built character. They also had a tradition called burying the hatchet. Burying the hatchet happened near the end of the seniors' final year at the college. It was a very clandestine operation. The seniors would send out an invitation to several members of the junior class to meet around midnight someplace off campus. And what the seniors would do would say that whatever they said about the juniors in the past didn't matter anymore. They were really happy with them and they expected them to be good seniors. They used to write and sign a proposal about that. And that's how the seniors and juniors got along after their years at the college. There was also a tradition called buttoning, which was part of hazing for freshmen. Everyone, well, not everyone, but in those days, classes could be identified by the beanies they wore. And a buttoning was a tradition whereby if someone of the upper class asked a freshman to button, they had to kneel down, put their finger on top of their cap, which had a button on it, and say to the upper class person that they were lowly freshmen. So the classes had a lot of interaction, but again, these are all from Tasky, doing the illustrations in the yearbook. And again, this is Tasky's illustration about several things that happened at the college. Baseball, which was basically the first sport that was an intercollegiate sport at the college. It started in the 1860s. Hiram had a team. They would play a number of area, both high schools and colleges. And then the baseball, of course, became an intercollegiate sport much later. There's a picture here of a woman playing basketball. Women played basketball from the early 1900s at the college. They played against, actually, the Miller women played the Bowler women for the most part in those days, because those were the two dormitories that actually were women dormitories at the time. The administrators didn't really like the idea of women playing basketball. They tried to stop it, but it didn't work out. Women continued to play, and they continued to play this particular sport for quite a long time. And then they actually could get letters too, just like men could, even though they didn't have intercollegiate sports for women at the time. But they could play team sports. They played both like field hockey. They played basketball. They even played baseball. And if they earned enough credits for doing this, they could get an H letter, just like the gentleman. And as I told you, oratory and debate was the sport just as much as anything else at the college. It was as important to be the champion. And there were the literary societies, the men's literary societies, had annual competitions of oratory and debate. This image is by Tasky also. He did a set of postcards in about 1920, 25, I think, that were sold at the bookstore here, which I have a copy of this particular one. I don't know. We looked in the archives, we couldn't find any more of them. But they showed many sort of scenes at the college, and this is Old Main. And Tasky himself was an ex-student in 1919. He studied here, he studied in New York, and he studied in Paris. He did most of his work during the 1935 to 1945 period when he worked for the Federal Art Project, which was a Depression-era project. He worked in New York. He worked with many of the artists there, and his art is represented at several museums: the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of the City of New York, the National Gallery of Art, the New York Public Library, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. These are some of the other images that he did. The one on the left is called Manhattan Sheep. It was done during the Depression. The one on the right is an image of a canal. And so Tasky was a rather interesting thing, and you learn a lot, again, history from just looking at some of the images that you can find. Now, to have a little bit of fun before I finish, this is a story about two Campbells, both graduates of Hiram College. I was looking for Florence Campbell, who was the important one that I thought of the college, and I ended up finding an article about another Florence Campbell who was married to Harry Campbell, or Harrison Campbell, and he was a graduate of Hiram. Their stories are rather interesting. In the late 1800s, Florence Mildred Campbell, the woman on the left, went to California after she had graduated from Hiram with a delegation from West Virginia to visit Santa Cruz to learn about what was happening in Santa Cruz. When that delegation left, she stayed, and she began lecturing on a topic called the New Woman. The New Woman wasn't at the time, the New Woman was depicted as a cigarette smoking, bicycle riding, trouser wearing female. That wasn't exactly her idea of what the New Woman was. Most people were surprised when they saw her on stage to begin her lecture. She came out dressed in flowing white gowns. She was from West Virginia, so she had a touch of Southern belle in her. And she contended that the women had the right to engage in any profession or business if they were capable. And they could determine that themselves. In fact, if they wanted to be a mother, that was just fine for Campbell. Obviously, that provided some headlines to folks in the newspapers. She also made some headlines just a few years later. She started seeing a gentleman named John Ratham in San Francisco. Ratham was married at the time. One day, Campbell and her housekeeper said that a box of cherries had arrived to the house. And when the two ate them, they got very sick. Campbell contended that those cherries came from Ratham's wife, who wanted to see her out of the picture. The police did an investigation and found that the current Mrs. Ratham did not send those cherries. In fact, Florence Campbell sent the cherries to herself. But she wasn't ever charged with a crime because the district attorney said that sending something to poison yourself was not a crime. Well, in the end, she did live the rest of her life with John Revelstoke Ratham. They were never married. Ratham himself generated some publicity during World War I when he began a series exposing the presence of German spies in the United States. But those stories were not true, and the publication had to be discontinued. Campbell went on to be a journalist from 1910 to 1922. She moved with Ratham to Rhode Island, and he was the editor of the Providence Journal and Evening Bulletin. She volunteered her time quite a bit. She passed away in 1956, just as I told you about another woman that, or other person that you could put down a sentence in the spider web about yourself. Her sentence was, "Trust her not. She is fooling thee." The other Campbell was Harrison Campbell, Harrison Lester Campbell. He played baseball at Hiram College. After college, he played baseball for a minor league team in Prattsville, New York, and he married Florence Myers, who was 16 at the time. Campbell moved back to Cleveland. He farmed and was a preacher. Another person in Prattsville at the time was named George Davis when he played there. And he was the bat boy for the team that Campbell played for. Davis became a member of the Cleveland Spiders until 1893, at which time he was traded to the New York Giants. That summer, the Giants came back to play in Cleveland, to play the Spiders. And what happened was that Davis and Mrs. Campbell and their two children ran off together. Campbell sued for divorce, and it was granted. Now, the story might end there, but it doesn't really. There's a little bit more about Campbell. In 1901, he wanted to marry someone else. It was an 18-year-old girl named Helen Usher, and she was from Chardon, Ohio. But the judge wouldn't give him the license to do so. And this came in the aftermath of Campbell's other failed marriage to Adela Bittner. And Campbell gave her an uncontested divorce because he said he wasn't in his right mind at the time of the marriage. Now, why did he have these sort of peculiarities? Well, the story goes that when he was at Hiram, he got hit in the head with a baseball, and he suffered a blood clot. And he had gone to several doctors, but they could not find out exactly what happened to him and why he was sort of had these strange ways about him. So Campbell unfortunately died in 1903. He was in Iowa at the time. I don't know if he was searching for his fourth wife, but he died of pneumonia. But the interesting thing, as I said, is the serendipity that happened. Looking for Florence Campbell in the newspapers, I turned up another Florence Campbell that was unrelated to the first Florence Campbell, but both of the Campbells in the papers had a Hiram background, be it good or bad. So Harry Campbell was a graduate and Florence Campbell was a graduate from Hiram. But those are sort of stories of maybe alumni you might not like to know about, but there are some stories of alums you would.
Dear, what can the matter be, dear?
No, this isn't right. Oops. The last slide is, oh, well, one more second.
This one here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool.
Oh, yeah, I gotta reshare. Oh, we lost our sound.
You probably know me. My statue, the Garfield one, stands outside of Koratansky Hall. I always loved it here and loved to learn. As I walk around, I'm glad my old house still stands next to Bonnie Castle. I'm here to tell you stories of the amazing people who have walked across campus following in my footsteps. They all have their accomplishments and perhaps a few disappointments. When I describe them, remember many more chose paths to success. It's just that some stories are longer in the making. One graduate was the poet Rachel Lindsay. In 1909, he walked from Illinois to New Mexico, preaching the gospel of beauty. He sold copies of his own verses, rhymes to be traded for bread, and recited them wherever he could gather an audience. You should read his collection, The Congo and Other Poems. Talking of language, Samuel Kenny, class of 1898, was an expert. He was called the Dean of American Phoneticians for his work on pronunciation, including American Pronunciation, a textbook of phonetics for students of English, 1924, and A Pronouncing Dictionary of American English, 1944. Hiram was lucky to have him as a professor for 3 decades. Galen J. Rausch, class of 1915, and Carol John Rausch, class of 1916, changed the face of freight transportation in America by founding Roadway Express in Akron, Ohio. During an era when railroads moved most of America's goods, the Rausches foresaw a future where trucks could handle the needs of manufacturers. They would. Marjorie Edna Reed, class of 1918, became a doctor and was the first woman internist at the Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania General Hospital. She served as the chief of pediatric services there, too. Few women of her era were allowed into that men's club. Charity Ellen Cannon, class of 1934. Love of learning came from her parents, who were professors at the college. Cannon married a West Point instructor, Colonel Sumner Willard. Cannon wasn't happy about West Point's policy that forbade wives of officers from working outside the home. Her determination made her the first spouse of an officer to be employed on a full-time basis. She went on to become an internationally recognized authority on the French literary figure Christine de Pizan. C'est la vie. Norman Woodworth, class of 1866, had a career as a lawyer and politician. He was also a dabbler in things. In 1885, he patented a skating ring gyrator to assist novices to learn to skate. Think of a long bar on a pub that turns in a circle. A skater could hold on and not be good for falling. In his youth, Alan Collins Vine, class of 1936, used to go to the local telephone company's junk piles in Garrettsville and collect discarded wires and electrical equipment to build contraptions such as burglar alarms. It wasn't a surprise to me that he co-developed the alumnus, a deep ocean submersible vehicle that made 12 dives to the RMS Titanic wreck. I did meet Benjamin Dudley Pritchard, a member of the Eclectic in 1858. He fought in the Civil War, and his unit captured Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. Now that's a president. He became a lawyer, banker, and state treasurer at Michigan. There are so many more stories I could tell you. I could mention Howard Junior Brown, who graduated in 1954 and was a founding member of the National Gay Task Force. Bill White, a Hiram student in the 1950s, who played for the San Francisco Giants, St. Louis Cardinals, and Philadelphia Phillies, and became the first black president of baseball's National League. Or Jean Blakely, class of 1944, a nurse in Vermont State Senate. Lance Leota, a preeminent cancer researcher. Carol Zelas Perez, class of 1975, the U.S. ambassador to Chile. Sharon Creech, class of 1967, the winner of the Newbery Medal. Or Richard Dyer, class of 1963, chief music critic of the Boston Globe. There are so many. Before I close, I wanted to tell you about two graduates who won the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship. Minor Cyril Bates, class of 1916, and Stephen Kemp Bailey, class of 1937. Bates became a missionary in China and put his own life in danger to protect the people in his care when Japan invaded. And smarts. The man had a PhD in Oriental Studies from Yale and took courses in Russian and Japanese languages at Harvard. Bailey wasn't an academic like me. His Harvard PhD dissertation, Congress Makes a Law, was published and won the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Prize in 1952. He served as Keppel Professor of Education and Administration at Harvard University, was elected president of the American Association for Higher Education, received 8 honorary degrees, and served as vice president of the American Council of Education. All in a day's work, right? And by the way, I did okay. I became the 20th president of the United States. Not bad for a poor boy born in a log cabin in Ohio. Hiram can take you anywhere.
Hiram took me to the archives and beyond. Thank you.
So first, I'll just say, Tom, thank you very much. And those of you in the audience, if you don't know Tom personally, which I think a lot of you do, so I met him probably like 2 weeks in of my time here at Hiram. And he's asking me all these archival questions, and I have learned so much because of the questions that he asked and from him. And so I just want to really acknowledge the work that he has done and the support for the college and the support for the library has been incredible. And so thank you very much for coming here and your time. And now Ella will go around and help you ask questions. And folks on Zoom, please also feel free to ask your questions.
Oh, good. I might not be able to answer.
Of all the pictures that you could choose to dig into the personalities, why did you choose that particular photograph?
The one of
All the students.
yeah. I just thought it was a fascinating picture. It was it had a nice feeling to it. I mean, it was a sort of a warm, friendly feeling. A lot of those students in there, from looking at the newspaper articles, after they were through at the university, at the college, they got together still in the Cleveland area. They, you would read these things that they did in the papers in those days, like XYZ went to visit XYW in Fairfield, Ohio. And so you could find out where these people did. And so they remained, many of them remained lifelong friends. But the picture felt sort of very nice in some ways. You know, there was a nice camaraderie there. I don't know, I have to do more research, obviously. I'm not sure if they were like members of an eating club at the school at the time, because there weren't, at that point in time, there weren't dining halls. So they would have had to find their meals someplace else. Or they were, I don't think they all could have roomed together, because there wasn't any house at Hiram at the time that was large enough to take all of them. So maybe one day I'll look through some of the yearbooks and find out, you know, if they were members of something, or they just knew each other from being at the college, and they decided to do the picture. And it would be fascinating to find out, like, who took the picture, why they took the picture. But some of those things are impossible to find out, I think.
I love that picture too, and it was really cool to zoom in on each of their faces and just think about the individual in their life.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a question, 2 questions online. So the first question that came in online, Tom, is there a particular Hiram tradition that you find the most interesting?
The one I think that I would like them to redo as a tradition is tree planting. Garfield loved trees. He had trees planted on campus. When he got here, it was farmland here. Basically, there weren't very many trees. So the students went out to the neighboring areas and dug up trees and brought them to campus, and he directed where to plant them. And then it was a tradition for graduating classes to plant a tree, which I think is a very, I guess, environmentally nice way, depending on what the tree is. And since there's, all the trees now have the plaques on them to designate what the trees are, it would be fun to see trees planted, different types of trees, as a gift of the graduating class. I think that's one of, I mean, there's several other ones, but I think that's the one that's sort of the one I think I like the most.
That's wonderful. And for those of you who haven't explored, we do have a brand new level 3 arboretum on campus now. So explore that. Sustainability coordinator Zach Fox coordinated that. And the second question, I know David Anderson is here in the room. There's a question about a little bit more about David's contributions to the book, if you want to talk about that.
Sure. Several years ago, David and I did a class on copy editing, and David had a manuscript that he did, and he wanted to tell Hiram's history in the words of the people that were there at the time. Earlier when I talked about how when we write history, we might put our own spin on it. In today's day and age, you know we do that. So the class took that manuscript and used it for copy editing. And that was the basis for what ended up as the book. It was expanded. It was David's presentation was chronological. We split it up more into subjects. And did extra research and annotations. And so it was the basis for what ended up happening. And it was the class, I remember the class too, we brought them to the archives. And this was one of the things that was just like overwhelming for them, that they could go in the archives and see all these things that had happened in the past. So it was a real nice way to show students about the history of the college.
And I should add, you do credit David as author and
yes,
he was editor,
absolutely.
so
yes.
That is there. And one more question came in, and this one, go ahead.
Oh, one thing I wanted to make sure that everyone understood, that Vachel Lindsay actually was not a graduate of the college, but he did get an honorary degree in 1931, shortly before he committed suicide, unfortunately.
And I think this is a fitting question because we do have a descendant, great-great-grandson of James A. Garfield is here in the room, Tim Garfield. Not to call you out or anything like that, but I've done it. And the question is, in your opinion, what would James A. Garfield think of Hiram today? Would he be surprised by anything, proud of anything, or disappointed by anything?
You want me to answer that question? Well, I think he probably would have been, that when you think about it, right, and a lot of the things are the same. I mean, not this, but the houses, right? He would have recognized some of these places around here. Walking around, we've been a little bit different in a lot of ways. The school isn't that much larger footprint-wise when he was here. When I read about Garfield and read about Garfield and what he did, it's unfortunate that he wasn't president for a longer period of time. He was very, I thought, forward-thinking in what he did. He was very articulate in how he spoke. I always wondered how in the newspaper stories, they couldn't have had people like taking his speeches down word for word. I hope they had a copy of it that they could do or someone did it, I'm not sure, but they were rather long speeches. To speak that long, I couldn't do that, I don't think. I think that he emphasized sort of the spirit of learning and the spirit of what a liberal arts education meant. And I think he was a very inclusive person. I think he probably would be happy with a lot of things that are at the college. Would he be disappointed in anything? Probably don't teach Greek and Latin anymore. Yeah, please.
I'd like to add to what Garfield would recognize, but would be puzzled by, and that is the meeting house, the Quartetsky Hall, which he knew that very building, that is, one that was exactly like that, except that it was on the site of the present church and burned to the ground through arson by this discomfited student, unfortunately. Yes. That had disappeared. So to come into town today for him would be to have a deja vu of an enormous level, because by accident, the church that we have here today, or the chapel or the meeting house that comes from Mecca, Ohio, is a twin of the church that was built originally here in 1844. Coincidence, but an astonishing one.
So I'm from Mentor, Ohio, and I've been to the James A. Garfield house there. There's some nods to Hiram's history in minor places like plaques and things like that. So I was wondering if that would be a thread you'd want to pull in the future in terms of like the connections between that. There's like that triangle of Garfield history between Cleveland and his crypt, his house in Mentor, and then his house and history at Hiram. So I was just wondering if you'd ever delve into that and the connections between his education at Hiram and his stump pulling going into his presidency.
Yeah, maybe in another book, although I think some of that has been written, but I think some of the fascinating thing there is a bit of that, growing up and as he did, someone actually helped him come to college. There was a person in his life that donated some money to him that got him here, and then he obviously worked when he got here. So there was that particular piece. Yeah, I think that there's sort of I know they do a presidential tour, or have done it in the past, and I think they visit here and they visit there, both places there. Yeah, I think you know, they have all of these letters that he wrote that are in the Library of Congress. Not all of them have been transcribed, from what I know. And I look at them and I go bleary sometimes trying to, but with the technologies that are available now, you probably could do a little bit more of the transcription. Some have been. I think that he himself, because of the opportunities had here, really did love being at the college. You know, as you probably know, he wasn't going to be nominated to become president. It was sort of happenstance that brought him to the ticket. So, you know, he visited here before he left for Washington. So I think he probably, there was sort of something very, very special. I mean, his kids grew up here, a number of his kids did, and 2 of his kids are buried in the cemetery here at Fairview. So it's like being home, I would guess, for him. But you know, there's always those sort of connections that go around. I haven't ever visited the Garfield, sorry to say, house. The only thing I went by was the Garfield Army Base. That's sort of over here now. I didn't even know they named it the James A. Garfield, whatever it is. 5 years ago, yeah.
Well, and I think, Ella, if I can have the microphone. This is a great opportunity to also plug the Garfield Trail, which is inclusive of Hiram College, the Garfield home in Menor, the birth site in, thank you, I was gonna say Orange, but Moreland Hills officially, right? And then the cemetery site at Lakeview. And we do have flyers about that on the table there next to the information about the Friends of the Library, because I thought this group would be very interested in that if you hadn't already heard about it. And one of the things that we are working towards is promoting more working together between the sites, helping each other and promoting the connection with James A. Garfield. So, you know, visit the other sites and support them as well if you would like. Other questions? Yeah.
So to the point of the question of what would he think if he came back to campus today? The one thing I've learned about him was that as brilliant as he was and intelligent and so forth, he's a pretty humble man. I think he turned the corner at 782 here and see that statue and go, wow. In travels, you know, I make comments lots of times. We don't have royalty in this country, but we have 46 families. I'm lucky enough to be part of one of them. It's not a birth, but I'm lucky enough to be there. But in travels around the country, we find his statues in some of the strange places that you wouldn't think would be reasonable. And I'm sure if he traveled the country today and saw his name on streets, communities and other things, he'd probably be the same way. He'd look at it and I don't understand. I didn't do that much. To your point, I think if he lived longer, I think he probably would have served twice. I think he probably would have made a big difference in the way the world was. We wouldn't have a need for things like the Garfield Trail and stuff. And that's a project that it started 10 years ago. I dove into it real hard in the last 3 years. We have a nonprofit for it. We're really working hard to, Janet put it best, but promote the foresights working together, because they've all been independent for so long. Hiram's probably the least known of the sites in a lot of ways. But when we started this, David Dean dove in, put line and sinker, and got involved, and his attitude was real simple. We shared that history. But I've been to the Manor House, you know.
Yeah, well, I will, I promise.
And anybody who hasn't, you need to go visit that house. I grew up around that house. I grew up in that. I remember the house when it was part of the Western Reserve Historical Society, and it was nothing compared to what it is today. The federal government, the National Park Service did a magnificent job restoring that house to what it looked like. 1890? 1880, yeah. I mean, they recreated wallpapers, carpets, and other things. I mean, it's a stunning house. But it's a wonderful program. We love Hiram College, and we try to participate in things as much as we can. Thank you.
One thing, just maybe an ending note about Garfield. He was ambidextrous. And there's stories that go that in class, he would write his name on the board with both hands. So that, I don't, it wasn't because he wanted to impress, but he could do it. And the other thing too, he wasn't very athletic, but he did participate in sports. He would play baseball with students, but he would participate, which was sort of a fascinating thing to think that the president of the college at the time would do these sort of things, but he did those things. But I think the ambidextrous thing was really fascinating to me. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to the folks on Zoom. Please, 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 please enter your name. Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Thank you everybody on Zoom, and thank you everybody in the room here. Please do fill out the little raffle. We'll do the raffle in about 3 minutes, so rush on over there and fill out your name. And thank you again to everybody for coming. Thank you for your support of the Hiram College Library through the Friends of the Library, and thank you again to Tom for this wonderful and engaging presentation. And you got a lot of love from folks around the country who attended here in the Zoom. So people from Texas and people from Purdue. So thank you so much for broadening.
Thank you.
Broadening our reach for the Friends of the Library as well. So thank you everybody. Have a wonderful evening.